The notification chimed on my phone at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that would forever divide my life into before and after. Pacific Northwest Credit Union. Account withdrawal $47,000. Available balance $0. 00. I stared at the screen in our kitchen, coffee mug frozen halfway to my lips, as 8 years of marriage crumbled into digital pixels. My husband David was supposed to be at a job site in Gresham, but according to my bank account, he just drained our emergency fund completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The second notification arrived 30 seconds later, and this one made my blood turn to ice water. A photo text from an unknown number showing David and a redhead I'd never seen before, both laughing as they signed papers at what looked like a luxury car dealership. Her manicured hand rested possessively on his chest while he held up keys to a brand new silver BMW. The message below read, "Thanks for the down payment, sweetie. Your wife's money bought us the perfect couple's car. XOXO, Vanessa. My name is Rachel Thompson, I'm 34 years old, and I thought I knew the man I married. For 8 years I believed David was my partner, my best friend, the person who'd always have my back. I was about to discover just how wrong a person could be, and how satisfying justice could taste when served ice cold. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over our granite kitchen counter that we'd picked out together just 2 years ago. Everything in our Beaverton home suddenly felt like a lie, from the family photos smiling down at me from the mantle to the wedding ring that now felt like it was burning my finger. But as I stood there shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak, something else began building inside me. Something David had seriously underestimated. I pulled up my phone's banking app with trembling fingers, navigating to the emergency account we'd built together over the years. The account David thought contained our entire financial safety net. The account he'd just emptied to buy his mistress a luxury vehicle while I was at work, believing his devoted wife would never find out. The zero balance stared back at me mockingly, but instead of crying, I started to smile. David had always been careless with details, too confident in his own cleverness to pay attention to the fine print. What he didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn despite my trying to involve him in our financial planning, was that this emergency account was exactly what I'd named it in my private files, the trap account. A decoy fund I'd maintained for exactly this scenario, because my work in digital marketing had taught me that people's true natures eventually surface online, and I'd seen enough marriages implode to prepare for the possibility. The real emergency funds are actual savings, investments, and the inheritance from my grandmother that I'd never mentioned, sat safely in accounts David knew nothing about. Accounts at a different bank, under my maiden name, in a financial portfolio he'd never seen. While he thought he was stealing our life savings, he'd actually just taken the bait I'd been dangling for 3 years, ever since I'd first suspected something was wrong with our marriage. My phone buzzed again. This time it was David, and my heart hammered as I read his message, "Hey babe, running late at the Gresham site, might not be home until after 10. Love you." The casual lies flowed so easily from him, even through text. Love you. The words felt like acid on my screen. I sat down at our dining room table, the same one where we'd shared thousands of meals and made countless plans for our future, and began to think. David wasn't just cheating on me, he wasn't just stealing from me, he was flaunting it, sending photos through his girlfriend, making sure I'd see exactly how they were spending my money. This wasn't just betrayal. This was cruelty, calculated and deliberate. But two could play at calculated games, and David was about to learn that underestimating your opponent can be a very expensive mistake. I opened my laptop and began making calls, starting with Marcus Webb, the attorney who'd handled my grandmother's estate and had become a trusted friend over the years. Marcus had warned me once that in his experience, marriages fell apart in 2 ways, slowly then all at once. Today felt very much like the all at once part. "Rachel," Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice immediately concerned. "This is unexpected." "Everything all right?" "Not exactly," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I need to ask you about divorce proceedings in Oregon, and I need to ask you about financial fraud." There was a pause. "I see, can you come to my office? This sounds like a conversation we should have in person." "Actually, I think I need to handle some things first." "But Marcus, hypothetically speaking, if someone stole money from a joint account without their spouse's knowledge or consent, what would that be considered legally?" Hypothetically, Marcus said carefully, that could be considered theft, fraud, or conversion depending on the circumstances. Oregon takes financial abuse in marriages very seriously, especially if there's evidence of deception or intent to hide assets. Why do I have the feeling this isn't hypothetical? I'll call you back, I said. I need to document everything first. The next hour passed in a blur of screenshots, phone calls, and careful note-taking. I documented every transaction, saved every message, and began building a timeline of David's recent behavior. The late nights he'd claimed were work-related. The mysterious conference in Seattle last month that he'd attended alone. The new cologne. The way he'd started guarding his phone like state secrets. All the classic signs I'd been too trusting, too busy with my own career, to piece together properly. But now they formed a clear pattern, and I could see exactly how long this had been going on. My sister Lisa called just as I was printing out bank statements. Lisa lived in Seattle and worked as a private investigator, specializing in corporate fraud cases. She'd always been the skeptical one in our family, the one who'd asked probing questions about David when I'd first started dating him. Questions I'd dismissed because I was in love and convinced she was just being overprotective. "Hey Rack," she said, her voice bright with sisterly affection. "How's married life treating you?" The irony of her timing almost made me laugh. "Actually, Lisa, I think I might need your professional services." Her tone shifted immediately. "What's going on?" I told her everything, the drained account, the photos, the pattern of lies. Lisa listened without interruption, and I could practically hear her investigator brain clicking into gear. "Okay," she said when I finished. "First thing, don't confront him yet, don't let him know you know anything. If he's this brazen about flaunting his affair, he's either incredibly stupid or he's planning something bigger. Either way, we need more information before you make any moves." "I already have a plan," I said quietly. "Rachel," Lisa's voice carried a warning. "Whatever you're thinking, remember that revenge can get messy legally. You want to be smart about this." "I'm not talking about revenge," I said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. "I'm talking about justice. And I'm talking about making sure that when this is over, David and his girlfriend understand exactly what they've cost themselves." That evening, I sat in our living room waiting for David to come home, the printed bank statements spread across the coffee table like evidence at a crime scene. But I wasn't planning to confront him. Not yet. Instead, I was going to do something much more strategic. I was going to let him think he'd gotten away with it. David finally walked through the front door at 10:30, his construction boots echoing against our hardwood floors. He looked tired, or maybe guilty. I couldn't tell which anymore. Everything about him seemed different now that I knew the truth, as if a filter had been removed from my eyes. "Hey beautiful," he said, leaning down to kiss my forehead in the same casual way he had for years. His lips felt cold against my skin. "Sorry I'm so late, the Gresham project is turning into a nightmare." "No problem," I replied, closing my laptop casually. "How was your day?" "Oh, you know. Same old construction drama. Permits, inspections, the usual headaches." He moved toward the kitchen, loosening his tie. "What did you get up to?" I watched him pour himself a glass of water, noting how his hands weren't particularly dirty for someone who'd spent the day at a construction site, just work stuff. "Had a client meeting that ran long." I paused, then added the hook I'd spent all evening perfecting. "Oh, and I got a weird notification from the bank earlier. Something about unusual account activity on our emergency fund. Probably just a system glitch." David's hand froze with the water glass halfway to his lips. For just a moment, panic flashed across his face before he controlled his expression. "Huh, that's strange. What kind of activity?" I couldn't really tell from the notification. I figured I'd call them tomorrow and sort it out. I stretched and yawned, as if this was the most boring topic in the world. "I'm beat, I'm going to head up to bed early." "Yeah, good idea," David said, relief evident in his voice. "I'll be up in a bit." As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I could hear him already dialing his phone. I paused on the landing, listening to his hushed conversation. "It's me," he said quietly. "We might have a problem." "She got a notification from the bank." "No, she doesn't seem to suspect anything, but we need to be more careful." I know. Look, just give me a few days to figure out the next step." The next step. So this wasn't over. David wasn't just stealing from me once, he was planning to continue. My hands clenched into fists as I continued up to our bedroom, but alongside the anger, I felt something else growing. A cold, calculating satisfaction. David was about to learn that his biggest mistake wasn't just betraying me. It was underestimating me. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared for 8 years and opened my laptop again. The real bank accounts, the ones David knew nothing about, showed a very different picture than the emptied emergency fund he'd just drained. The inheritance from my grandmother, that I'd invested carefully. The percentage of my salary I'd been diverting for years into private accounts. The profits from the small digital marketing consultancy I'd built on the side. David thought he'd married a naive woman who trusted him completely with their finances. What he'd actually married was someone who'd learned early in life to prepare for disappointment and plan for betrayal. My grandmother had taught me that a woman should always have her own money, her own plans, and her own escape route. I'd thought I'd never need that advice with David, but apparently, grandmother had been wiser than I'd realized. Over the next several days, I watched David like a scientist observing a specimen. He was more affectionate than he'd been in months, bringing me coffee in the morning and suggesting we plan a weekend getaway. The guilt-driven kindness of a man trying to ease his conscience while planning his next betrayal.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I played along perfectly, accepting his attention while documenting everything. Lisa had flown down from Seattle under the pretense of a sister visit, but she was actually conducting surveillance on David and his mystery woman. Within 48 hours, she'd identified Vanessa Price, a real estate agent who specialized in luxury properties. She was 31, recently divorced, and according to Lisa's research, had a pattern of dating married men with money. "She's done this before," Lisa reported as we sat in a coffee shop downtown, far from anywhere David might unexpectedly appear. "At least twice that I can confirm. She targets successful married men, gets them to spend money on her, then moves on when either the wife finds out or the money runs dry. So I'm not her first victim," I said, stirring my latte thoughtfully. "No, and you probably won't be her last unless someone stops her pattern." Lisa slid a folder across the table. "David's been seeing her for at least 4 months. They've been to restaurants, hotels, weekend trips to the coast. He's been spending money steadily, but the car purchase was definitely the biggest single expense." I opened the folder to find photographs, receipts, credit card statements that Lisa had somehow obtained through her investigative contacts. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. But what struck me most was how happy David looked in the photos. Happier than I'd seen him in years with me. That realization should have hurt more than it did, but instead, it just made me more resolved. David didn't just want to steal my money, he wanted to replace me entirely. Which meant my response needed to be equally comprehensive. "Lisa," I said, closing the folder, "how would you feel about helping me teach both of them a lesson they'll never forget?" My sister's smile was sharp as a blade. "I thought you'd never ask." That weekend, David announced he needed to work Saturday and Sunday to catch up on the Gresham project. I told him I understood, and that I'd probably spend the weekend doing some shopping and catching up on client work. He seemed relieved that I wasn't asking questions or wanting to spend time together. What David didn't know was that I'd already verified the Gresham project had been completed the previous week. There was no weekend work, which meant he was planning to spend 2 full days with Vanessa, probably celebrating their successful theft of what they believed was my life savings. Perfect. That gave me plenty of time to set the next phase of my plan in motion. Saturday morning, after David left for his fictional job site, I drove to downtown Portland and walked into the Pacific Northwest Credit Union branch, where our emergency account had been held. I'd made an appointment with the branch manager, Helen Rodriguez, who'd been handling our accounts for years. "Mrs. Thompson," Helen greeted me with professional concern. "I was so sorry to hear about the unauthorized withdrawal from your emergency fund. Our fraud department has been investigating since you reported it." "Actually, Helen," I said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "I need to clarify something about that report. The withdrawal wasn't unauthorized." Helen's eyebrows rose. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. My husband had legitimate access to that account. What he didn't have was accurate information about what that account actually represented." I pulled out a folder of documents I'd prepared. I need to make some changes to our banking arrangements, and I need to discuss some concerns about financial fraud that extends beyond just that one withdrawal. Over the next hour, I walked Helen through the situation, providing documentation of David's deception and evidence of his affair. Helen listened with growing concern, taking careful notes. Mrs. Thompson, this is clearly a case of financial infidelity, and given the evidence you're showing me of systematic deception, we need to involve our security department. This isn't just a marital dispute. This appears to be a deliberate scheme to defraud you of marital assets. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, I replied, because I have a proposal for how to handle this situation that I think will benefit everyone involved except the people who deserve to be held accountable. By the time I left the bank, I'd set in motion a plan that would make David and Vanessa's car purchase look like pocket change compared to what they were about to lose. The trap account had served its purpose perfectly, but now it was time to spring a much larger trap. One that would teach both of them that stealing from the wrong person can cost far more than just money. It can cost everything. Monday morning arrived with the kind of Pacific Northwest drizzle that matched my mood perfectly. David had returned from his supposed weekend of construction work looking refreshed and guilty in equal measure, bringing me expensive flowers and suggesting we book a dinner reservation at the Pearl Room for Friday night. His sudden generosity would have been touching if I didn't know he was spending my money to ease his conscience while planning his next theft. I sat in my office at Digital Dynamics, the marketing firm where I'd worked for 6 years, staring at my computer screen but seeing none of the campaign proposals that needed my attention. Instead, I was thinking about patterns. In my line of work, I analyzed consumer behavior, tracked purchasing decisions, and predicted how people would respond to different stimuli. What I'd discovered over the weekend was that my husband had become just another data point in a predictable pattern of deception. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa, package delivered. Check your email. I opened my personal account to find a comprehensive dossier on Vanessa Price that would make a government background check look superficial. Lisa had outdone herself, pulling together financial records, employment history, social media activity, and even interviews with Vanessa's previous targets. The picture that emerged was disturbing in its calculated precision. Vanessa Price wasn't just a woman who happened to fall for married men. She was a predator who targeted specific types of husbands: successful, financially stable, emotionally neglected men who were ripe for manipulation. She'd perfected a system over the past 5 years, leaving a trail of broken marriages and drained bank accounts across 3 states. David was victim number 7 that Lisa could document, though she suspected there were others who'd been too embarrassed to report what had happened to them. The pattern was always the same. Vanessa would identify a target through her real estate connections, engineer a meeting that seemed accidental, then gradually escalate the relationship while encouraging increasingly expensive gestures. The car purchase was actually modest compared to some of her previous scores. One man in California had bought her a boat, another in Nevada had invested over $100,000 in a business venture that turned out to be completely fictional. But what made Vanessa's operation particularly insidious was her exit strategy. She never stayed around long enough for the wives to confront her directly. By the time the marriages imploded and the financial damage was discovered, she'd already moved to a new city and started hunting fresh prey. The men were left dealing with divorce proceedings and financial ruin, while she disappeared like smoke. Reading through the files, I felt my anger crystallizing into something much more focused and dangerous. This wasn't just about David's betrayal anymore. This was about stopping a pattern of deliberate destruction that had ruined multiple families. Vanessa Price had made a career out of exploiting trust and destroying marriages, and she'd chosen the wrong target for her final performance. I picked up my phone and called Marcus Webb's office. His secretary, Patricia, put me through immediately. "Rachel," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of our weekend phone conversations. "How are you holding up?" "I'm ready to move forward," I said. "But Marcus, this situation is bigger than just my marriage. I'm going to need your help with something that extends beyond divorce proceedings." "What kind of help?" "The kind that involves stopping a criminal enterprise disguised as a series of affairs." There was a long pause. "I think you better come in.
Oh,
Can you be here this afternoon?" 2 hours later, I sat in Marcus's downtown office overlooking the Willamette River, watching his expression grow increasingly grim as I walked him through Lisa's research. Marcus was in his early 50s, a former prosecutor who'd moved into private practice after getting tired of plea bargains and reduced sentences. He had the sharp, analytical mind of someone who'd spent years building cases against people who thought they were too clever to get caught. "This is extensive," he said, flipping through the documentation. Your sister does impressive work. But Rachel, what exactly are you proposing? Because if you're thinking about some kind of vigilante justice, I have to advise against it. I'm thinking about something much more effective than vigilante justice, I replied. I'm thinking about using the legal system exactly as it was designed to be used, but with enough evidence and strategic planning to make sure justice actually happens. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, studying me with the same intensity he'd once reserved for hostile witnesses. Explain. Vanessa Price has committed fraud in multiple states. She's engaged in systematic deception for financial gain, which qualifies as racketeering under federal law. David has committed theft, potentially rising to felony levels depending on how much money he's taken from our accounts over time. But here's the thing, Marcus. They both think they're too smart to get caught, and they're about to make mistakes that will give us everything we need to prosecute them properly. How can you be so certain they'll make mistakes? I smiled, feeling the satisfaction of a well-planned campaign coming together. Because I'm going to create irresistible opportunities for them to incriminate themselves. David thinks he married a naive woman who trusts him completely. Vanessa thinks she's dealing with another clueless wife who won't figure out what's happening until it's too late. They're both about to discover they've seriously misjudged their opposition. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then reached for his legal pad. Tell me your plan. Over the next hour, I outlined a strategy that would have made my grandmother proud and my old marketing professors applaud. The beauty of catching financial predators, I'd realized, was that their greed made them predictable. If you could anticipate their next move, you could prepare a trap that would snap shut at exactly the right moment. Phase 1 is already complete, I explained. The trap account served its purpose perfectly. David thinks he's successfully stolen our life savings, which gives him confidence to attempt bigger thefts. Vanessa thinks she's successfully manipulated him into a major purchase, which makes her eager to push for even more expensive gestures before she disappears. And Phase 2 involves giving them exactly what they want while documenting everything for law enforcement. I pulled out my phone and showed Marcus a text message I'd received that morning from David. Hey babe, I've been thinking we should look into investment opportunities. Maybe real estate. I heard about some great deals from a colleague. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. This colleague would be Vanessa Price, and she's about to present him with an amazing investment opportunity that requires a substantial upfront payment. Exactly. And when David approaches me about investing money we supposedly don't have because he thinks he's already stolen our savings, I'm going to be very supportive of his entrepreneurial spirit. Rachel, Marcus said carefully. You're talking about deliberately participating in a fraud scheme to gather evidence. That's legally complicated and potentially dangerous. I'm talking about allowing criminals to incriminate themselves while making sure law enforcement has everything they need for successful prosecutions. I corrected, David and Vanessa are going to commit additional crimes whether I participate or not. My involvement just ensures we have proof and can minimize the damage to other potential victims. Marcus made notes as I continued explaining the strategy. The fake real estate investment would be the perfect crime for documenting their methods. Real estate fraud was easy to trace, required extensive paperwork that would serve as evidence, and involved the kind of large dollar amounts that elevated charges from misdemeanors to felonies. But here's the elegant part, I said, warming to my subject. The investment property they're going to try to sell me actually exists. It's a legitimate piece of real estate that I've already purchased through a shell company. So when they attempt to defraud me by selling me property they don't own, I'll literally own the evidence of their crime. Marcus looked up from his notes. You bought real estate specifically for this operation. I bought real estate because it was a good investment and because I needed a way to demonstrate their criminal intent beyond any reasonable doubt. The property is a small commercial building in Northeast Portland that I can legitimately use for my consulting business. If this operation goes exactly as planned, it'll end up being the most profitable real estate purchase I've ever made. That evening I sat at our dining room table with my laptop open, working on what appeared to be routine marketing campaigns while actually coordinating the most complex operation I'd ever planned. David was in the living room watching television, occasionally glancing over at me with the guilty attention of a man trying to appear normal while planning his next betrayal. My phone rang at 8:30. David's number appeared on the screen, but he was sitting 15 feet away from me. I watched him pull out his phone, realize his mistake, and quickly cancel the call. He'd been trying to call someone else but had accidentally selected my number from his recent calls. The panicked look on his face told me everything I needed to know about who he'd actually intended to contact. Work call, I asked innocently, not looking up from my laptop. Wrong number, he said quickly. Someone called me by mistake. I nodded and continued typing, but I was actually documenting the incident and the timestamp. Every lie, every suspicious behavior, every small deception was going into a file that would eventually paint a comprehensive picture of David's guilt. In court, individual incidents might seem minor, but patterns of deception were devastating evidence. 20 minutes later, David announced he needed to step outside to take a business call. Through our front window, I watched him pace our driveway while having an animated conversation with someone who was clearly not a business associate. He kept looking back toward the house, checking to make sure I wasn't watching, while gesturing emphatically with his free hand. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I didn't need to. Lisa had provided me with surveillance equipment that would make a private investigator jealous, including recording devices that could capture audio from much greater distances. David's outdoor business call was being documented in high-definition detail, adding another piece to the evidence file that would eventually destroy both him and Vanessa. The next morning brought the text message I'd been anticipating. Babe, I know this is sudden, but I think I found an incredible investment opportunity. A colleague knows about a commercial property that's about to go on the market way below value. We'd need to move fast and put down some serious money, but the potential returns are amazing. Can we talk tonight? I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because my predictions were proving accurate, sadness because David was making choices that would destroy our marriage and his future. But those were his choices to make, and I wasn't responsible for the consequences of his decisions. I typed back, that sounds exciting. I've been thinking we should be more aggressive with our investments. Let's definitely talk tonight. David's response came immediately. Really, you're interested? I was worried you'd think it was too risky. I trust your judgment, I replied, knowing the words would feed his confidence and make him more likely to proceed with whatever scheme Vanessa had planned. If you think it's a good opportunity, I'm willing to consider it. That afternoon, I met Lisa for lunch at a small restaurant in Southeast Portland, far from David's usual haunts and Vanessa's real estate territory. Lisa had been busy over the weekend, not just researching Vanessa's background but also preparing the technical aspects of our operation. The surveillance equipment is in place, she reported quietly as we shared appetizers. David's phone is now mirroring to our monitoring system, so we'll have real-time access to his calls, texts, and emails. Vanessa's communications are being tracked through her real estate business accounts, which are surprisingly easy to access legally through public records and professional databases. Any updates on her previous victims? Lisa's expression darkened. 3 of them are willing to testify if we can guarantee prosecutions will actually happen. They've been waiting years for someone to stop her, but local law enforcement kept treating these as civil matters rather than criminal cases. The problem is that by the time the husbands realize they've been manipulated, Vanessa has already moved to a different jurisdiction. But this time she's not dealing with an isolated victim, I said. This time she's dealing with someone who understands how to build comprehensive evidence and coordinate with law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions. Speaking of law enforcement, Lisa said, sliding a business card across the table, I've made contact with Detective Sarah Kim at Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit. She's very interested in our case, especially when she learned about the interstate pattern. She's also connected with FBI agents who specialize in fraud schemes that cross state lines. I studied the business card, feeling another piece of the puzzle click into place. How much does Detective Kim know about our operation? Everything relevant to law enforcement. She knows about David's theft, Vanessa's pattern of fraud, and our evidence-gathering activities. What she doesn't know are the specific details of how you're planning to trap them, because she can't officially sanction entrapment operations. But she can respond appropriately when presented with clear evidence of ongoing crimes. Absolutely. And Rachel, she emphasized that what David and Vanessa are doing constitutes serious felony charges. This isn't just adultery and marital problems. This is systematic financial fraud with multiple victims across multiple states. If we can document their methods properly, they're looking at significant prison time. That evening, David presented his investment opportunity with the enthusiasm of a man who thought he'd found the perfect crime. He'd prepared a folder of documents, printed photographs of the commercial property, and even created a basic financial projection showing potential returns on investment. It's a small office building in Northeast Portland, he explained, spreading papers across our dining room table. The current owner needs to sell quickly due to financial problems, so they're willing to accept significantly below market value. But we'd need to move fast and put down $50,000 to secure the deal. I studied the documents with appropriate interest, noting that they were professionally prepared and completely convincing. Vanessa had done excellent work creating legitimate-looking paperwork for property she didn't own and couldn't legally sell. The building address, property descriptions, and even the financial projections were accurate based on real market data. This looks promising, I said carefully. But $50,000 is more than we have readily available. We'd need to access our emergency funds, and after that bank glitch last week, I'm not sure how much is actually in that account. David's face went through a series of subtle expressions: guilt, panic, calculation, and finally determination. Actually, he said slowly, I checked on that account issue. It turns out there was an error, but everything's been resolved. We have access to the full amount. I watched my husband lie directly to my face with an ease that was genuinely disturbing. After 8 years of marriage, I thought I knew David well enough to detect his deceptions, but he was demonstrating skills I'd never suspected he possessed. Are you sure? I asked. I was planning to call the bank myself tomorrow to verify everything. No need, David said quickly. I already spoke with them extensively. Everything's fine, and they've actually upgraded our account to prevent future issues. Another lie, delivered with confident authority. David was either a much better liar than I'd ever realized, or desperation was making him careless. Either way, he was providing exactly the kind of evidence that would be devastating in court. Well, if you're confident about the account status, I said, then I think we should seriously consider this investment. $50,000 is a significant amount, but if the returns are as good as these projections suggest, it could be the foundation for our retirement planning. David's relief was palpable. Really? You're willing to do this? I'm willing to trust your judgment, I replied. But I'd like to meet with the seller and see the property in person before we commit to anything. Is that possible? Absolutely, David said, already reaching for his phone. I'll set up a meeting for this weekend. As David made arrangements with his supposed colleague, I excused myself to use the bathroom and sent a quick text to Lisa. The hook is set. They're moving faster than we anticipated. Her response was immediate. Perfect. Detective Kim wants to know the timeline so she can coordinate with the district attorney's office. I typed back, tell her this weekend. And Lisa, make sure the recording equipment is ready. We're about to document the most expensive confession in Oregon legal history. Friday evening arrived with David insisting we celebrate our upcoming investment at the Pearl Room, the upscale restaurant he'd suggested earlier in the week. As we sat across from each other at a candlelit table, sharing expensive wine and perfectly prepared food, I felt like I was attending a wake for our marriage. David was more attentive than he'd been in months, asking about my work, complimenting my appearance, and making plans for future vacations we'd never take together. He was either trying to assuage his guilt, or ensure I remained unsuspecting until he could complete whatever larger scheme he and Vanessa had planned. I've been thinking, he said over dessert, maybe after this real estate deal goes through, we should look into other investment opportunities. Build a real portfolio, start planning seriously for the future. What kind of opportunities? I asked, genuinely curious about how far their scheme extended. Well, Vanessa mentioned that there might be other properties becoming available. Maybe we could start a small real estate investment business, flip some houses, build passive income streams. There it was. David wasn't planning to steal from me once and disappear. He was planning to establish an ongoing business relationship that would give him continued access to my money while maintaining his double life indefinitely. Vanessa had found herself a long-term mark, and David had convinced himself he could have both his marriage and his affair without ever having to choose between them. That sounds ambitious, I said. Would this be something you'd manage, or would your colleague be involved in the business side? Vanessa has the real estate expertise, David said, then caught himself. I mean my colleague Vanessa, she's the one with the industry connections and market knowledge. I nodded thoughtfully, filing away his slip of using her first name so casually. I'd like to meet her at some point. If we're going to be business partners, it would be good to get to know each other. David's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, I'm sure that can be arranged once we see how this first deal goes. As we drove home that evening, David seemed relaxed and confident, humming along to the radio and making casual conversation about weekend plans. He had no idea that every word he'd spoken at dinner had been recorded by the sophisticated listening device Lisa had sewn into my purse, or that our upcoming property meeting would be documented by surveillance equipment that would capture evidence sufficient to convict them both of multiple felonies. Saturday morning, David announced that our property viewing was scheduled for 10 a.m., and that we'd be meeting Vanessa at the building to go through the details and paperwork. He seemed excited, probably anticipating that this would be the moment when his careful deception finally paid off in a major way. I dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing clothes that would be appropriate for a legitimate business meeting while concealing the recording equipment Lisa had provided. In my purse I carried copies of financial documents that David thought represented our available funds, but which actually showed the balances of the closed trap account he'd already emptied. As we drove toward Northeast Portland, David kept up a steady stream of nervous chatter about the property's potential and the importance of making a good impression on the seller. He was clearly anxious, probably worried that something might go wrong with their elaborate scheme, but also excited about what he believed would be a successful conclusion to months of planning. I sat quietly beside him, watching familiar Portland neighborhoods pass by our car windows, thinking about how this drive represented the final miles of our marriage. In a few hours, David would have committed crimes that would send him to prison and destroy any possibility of reconciliation between us. But those were choices he was making willingly, with full knowledge that his actions constituted theft and fraud. The commercial building was exactly what I'd expected from the documents, a well-maintained two-story structure in a developing part of Northeast Portland that was genuinely worth the investment at market price. What David didn't know was that I'd already purchased this building through a shell company specifically for this operation, making me the actual owner of the property he was about to attempt selling to me through fraudulent means. Vanessa Price was waiting for us in the parking lot, and seeing her in person added another layer of understanding to David's betrayal. She was beautiful in an obvious way, with carefully styled red hair, expensive clothes, and the kind of confident demeanor that suggested she was accustomed to getting what she wanted from men. But more importantly, she carried herself like someone who was completely comfortable with deception, someone for whom lying was as natural as breathing. "You must be Rachel," she said, extending a manicured hand with a smile that never reached her eyes. "David has told me so much about you. I'm Vanessa Price, and I'm so excited to show you this amazing property." As I shook her hand and looked into her face, I felt the final pieces of my emotional attachment to David crumble away completely. This wasn't a woman who had seduced my husband in a moment of weakness. This was a predator who had targeted him deliberately, studied his vulnerabilities, and manipulated him into betraying everything he claimed to value. And David had chosen to participate willingly, becoming her accomplice in destroying our marriage and stealing my money. "I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to show us," I replied, matching her false smile with one of my own. "David says this could be the perfect opportunity for us to start building real wealth." What Vanessa didn't know, what David didn't know, and what would soon become devastatingly clear to both of them, was that they were about to attempt defrauding the actual owner of the property they were pretending to sell, while every word of their sales pitch was being recorded by law enforcement equipment that would provide irrefutable evidence of their crimes. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and all that remained was watching them destroy themselves with their own greed and arrogance. Vanessa led us through the commercial building with the polished confidence of someone who had done this many times before. She spoke knowledgeably about square footage, zoning regulations, and potential rental income, painting a picture of financial opportunity that would have been compelling if she actually had any legal right to sell the property. Her presentation was flawless, complete with detailed market analysis and renovation estimates that demonstrated genuine expertise in real estate investment. The current owner is motivated to sell quickly due to a divorce settlement, Vanessa explained as we toured the second-floor office spaces. He's willing to accept $400,000 for a property that's easily worth $550,000 in today's market. But the catch is that he needs a $50,000 earnest money deposit by Monday to hold the deal while we arrange financing. David nodded enthusiastically, playing his role as the eager husband who discovered this amazing opportunity through business connections. "The timeline is tight, but the numbers make sense. Even if we just held the property for 2 years and sold at market value, we'd clear over $100,000 in profit." I walked through the building taking careful notes, asking technical questions about utilities and maintenance costs, and generally behaving like someone conducting legitimate due diligence on a major investment. What I was actually doing was documenting every detail of their fraud attempt while waiting for them to make the statements that would constitute definitive criminal acts. This seems almost too good to be true, I said, examining the financial projections Vanessa had prepared. Are you certain about these market valuations? I'd hate to overextend ourselves based on optimistic assumptions. Vanessa's smile tightened slightly, the first crack in her professional facade. She was accustomed to dealing with men who made financial decisions based on emotion and ego, not wives who asked detailed questions about due diligence and market analysis. I understand your caution, Rachel, but I've been in Portland real estate for 8 years. These numbers are conservative, if anything. 8 years, I repeated thoughtfully. So you were active during the market correction in 2020. How did properties like this perform during that downturn? The question caught her off guard, because it required specific local market knowledge that couldn't be faked. For just a moment, Vanessa's confident demeanor wavered as she scrambled for an answer that would sound authoritative without being easily verifiable. Commercial properties in this area actually held their value quite well, she said finally. The neighborhood's demographics insulated it from the worst effects of the recession. It was a reasonable-sounding answer that was also completely wrong. Northeast Portland had been hit particularly hard during the 2020 downturn, with commercial vacancy rates reaching nearly 30%. Anyone who had actually been working in local real estate during that period would have known the accurate statistics, which meant Vanessa was either lying about her experience or had learned her market knowledge recently and superficially. David, meanwhile, was growing visibly anxious about my detailed questions. He'd clearly expected me to trust his judgment and agree to the investment without extensive analysis. My careful scrutiny was forcing both him and Vanessa to provide more detailed deceptions, creating additional evidence of their criminal intent. Honey, David interjected, we don't want to overthink this and miss out on a great opportunity. Vanessa has been generous with her time, and other investors are interested in the property. Of course, I said apologetically, I'm just being cautious because $50,000 represents such a significant portion of our available funds. Speaking of which, how exactly would we structure the earnest money payment? Would that go into an escrow account, or directly to the seller? Vanessa and David exchanged a quick glance, and I could practically see them realizing they hadn't prepared for this level of detailed questioning about the transaction mechanics. In a legitimate real estate deal, earnest money would automatically go into a licensed escrow account with specific legal protections for the buyer. In their fraudulent scheme, the money would presumably go directly to them. The seller prefers a direct transfer to expedite the process, Vanessa said carefully. We can arrange for the funds to go into my business account, and I'll handle the transfer to the seller from there. There it was, the definitive statement that transformed their scheme from suspicious behavior into documented criminal intent. Vanessa had just openly stated that she wanted $50,000 transferred directly to her personal business account for a property she didn't own and had no legal authority to sell. Combined with the recordings of their deceptive statements about property values and market conditions, we now had everything needed for felony fraud charges. That sounds reasonable, I said, pulling out my phone as if to check our banking app. Let me just verify our account balance to make sure we can handle the earnest money deposit. As I pretended to review our finances, I was actually sending a pre-arranged text message to Lisa, package delivered. Ready for pickup. Within minutes, Detective Kim and her team would be positioning themselves around the building, prepared to document the final stages of the fraud attempt and arrest both David and Vanessa when they completed the criminal transaction. Everything looks good, I announced, closing my phone with a satisfied smile. We can definitely handle the $50,000 deposit. How would you like us to arrange the transfer? Vanessa's relief was palpable. After months of careful manipulation and weeks of specific planning, she was minutes away from what she believed would be a successful theft of $50,000 from another naive wife. I can provide you with my business account information, and you can arrange a wire transfer first thing Monday morning. Once the funds clear, I'll immediately forward the earnest money to the seller, and we can proceed with the purchase contract. David was practically glowing with satisfaction, convinced that his elaborate deception had succeeded perfectly. He thought he'd manipulated me into agreeing to invest money we didn't actually have, while I remained completely unaware of his theft from our emergency account. In his mind, he was about to pull off the perfect crime, stealing my money to fund an investment that would generate profits he could share with his mistress. There's just one small detail I'd like to clarify, I said casually, still playing the role of the cautious but trusting wife. For our tax records, I'll need documentation showing that this is a legitimate business transaction. Do you have your real estate license information available, Vanessa? And David, since you're handling the business relationship, I'll need you to sign some papers acknowledging your role as our investment advisor. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Vanessa's face went pale as she realized I was asking for documentation that would create an official paper trail connecting her to the fraudulent transaction. David looked confused and increasingly panicked, sensing that something was going wrong, but not understanding exactly what. My license information is back at my office, Vanessa said slowly. And David isn't technically acting as an investment advisor. He's just facilitating the introduction between us. I understand, I replied pleasantly. But for an investment of this size, my accountant insists on proper documentation of everyone's roles and credentials. It's just a matter of protecting ourselves legally and ensuring everything is above board. David stepped closer to me, his voice carrying a note of desperation. Rachel, we don't need to complicate this with a lot of paperwork. This is a straightforward real estate transaction between private parties. Actually, David, I said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since discovering his betrayal, I think it's important that everything about this transaction be completely transparent and legally documented. Don't you agree? The question hung in the air like a challenge. David stared at me with growing alarm, finally beginning to realize that something fundamental had changed in our interaction. I was no longer the trusting wife who accepted his explanations without question. I was someone else entirely, someone who was asking pointed questions and demanding accountability. Of course, he said finally. Transparency is important. Wonderful, I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out a folder I'd prepared specifically for this moment. Then you won't mind signing these documents acknowledging your role in arranging this investment opportunity, and confirming that you've provided me with accurate information about our available funds. I handed David a legal document that Lisa and Marcus had prepared, designed to look like routine investment paperwork while actually serving as a confession of his theft and fraud. If David signed the papers, he would be acknowledging in writing that he had misrepresented our financial situation and had arranged for me to invest money under false pretenses. David took the papers with trembling hands, scanning the first page while his face grew increasingly pale. The legal language was dense enough to be confusing, but clear enough that anyone reading carefully would understand they were confessing to criminal activity. This seems unnecessarily complicated, David said weakly. Maybe we should have our lawyer review these documents before I sign anything. Our lawyer? I asked with raised eyebrows. David, when did we get a lawyer? And why would we need legal review for simple investment documentation? Vanessa was watching our exchange with growing alarm, clearly recognizing that her carefully orchestrated scheme was falling apart. She'd built her operation around manipulating men who made impulsive decisions based on greed and lust, not dealing with wives who demanded proper documentation and legal accountability. You know what? Vanessa interjected. Maybe we should postpone the paperwork until Monday. Give everyone time to review the documents properly and make sure we're all comfortable with the arrangement. That's an interesting suggestion, I said thoughtfully. But I'm curious, Vanessa, if this is such a time-sensitive opportunity, why would we risk losing it by delaying? Didn't you say other investors were interested in the property? Vanessa's professional mask was completely gone now, replaced by the calculating expression of someone trying to figure out how to escape from a trap. Well, yes, but I could probably convince the seller to hold the property for a few extra days if necessary. How generous of you, I replied. And how exactly would you convince him? Do you have that kind of influence with the seller? It was a simple question that exposed the fundamental flaw in their scheme. If Vanessa was merely a real estate agent representing the seller, she wouldn't have the authority to negotiate timeline extensions. If she claimed to have that kind of influence, she'd be admitting to a much closer relationship with the seller than she'd initially disclosed. We have a good professional relationship, Vanessa stammered. He trusts my judgment about qualified buyers. I see, I said, making a note on my legal pad. So you've worked with this particular seller before. On how many previous transactions? David was staring at Vanessa with dawning horror, finally realizing that her answers weren't making sense, and that I was systematically dismantling their story with questions he'd never thought to ask. His role in the scheme had been simple: manipulate his wife into agreeing to the investment. He'd never bothered to verify that Vanessa's claims about the property and the seller were actually true. Several transactions, Vanessa said vaguely. He's one of my regular clients. Excellent, I said, pulling out my phone again. Then you won't mind if I call him directly to confirm the details of our agreement. I'd like to introduce myself and make sure he's comfortable with our financial qualifications." The silence that followed was deafening. Both David and Vanessa stared at me with expressions of absolute panic, finally understanding that their elaborate scheme was collapsing around them. They'd spent months planning how to steal my money, but they'd never prepared for the possibility that I might want to verify their claims or insist on proper documentation. "Actually," Vanessa said slowly, "the seller is traveling internationally right now. He's not available for phone calls." "How convenient," I replied. "But surely he has local representation. A lawyer or business manager who could verify the transaction details." "It's complicated," David interjected desperately. "Rachel, maybe we should just take some time to think about this investment. There's no rush to make a decision today." I looked at my husband with something approaching pity. After 8 years of marriage, he was finally showing me who he really was. A man willing to steal from his wife, lie to her face, and participate in elaborate fraud schemes for money and sex. The David I'd fallen in love with had either never existed, or had been completely consumed by greed and selfishness. "Oh, but there is a rush," I said gently. "You see, David, I've been thinking about our financial situation quite a bit lately, especially since that mysterious withdrawal from our emergency account last week." David's face went completely white. "I told you that was a bank error. Everything was resolved." "Yes, you did tell me that," I agreed. "But when I called the bank myself yesterday, they had a very different story. They told me that the withdrawal was legitimate, made by someone with authorized access to the account. They also told me exactly where the money went." The folder I'd been carrying contained much more than investment documents. I pulled out bank statements, transaction records, and photographs that Lisa had compiled documenting David's theft and his spending with Vanessa. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, showing not just the car purchase, but months of expensive dinners, hotel stays, and cash withdrawals that coincided with his supposed business meetings. "This is what $50,000 bought," I said, spreading the photos across a nearby desk. "A BMW for your girlfriend, luxury vacations, expensive dinners, and cash payments that I'm sure Vanessa found very helpful for her business expenses." David stared at the evidence of his betrayal, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. Vanessa took a step backward toward the building's exit, clearly calculating whether she could escape before the situation deteriorated further. "But here's the interesting part," I continued conversationally. "The money you stole wasn't actually our emergency fund. It was what I call a trap account, designed specifically to catch financial infidelity. The real emergency funds, our actual savings, and my inheritance from my grandmother are all safely secured in accounts you know nothing about." The revelation hit David like a physical blow. He grabbed the edge of the desk for support, finally understanding that his months of careful planning had been based on completely false assumptions about our financial situation. "You knew," he whispered. "You knew I was stealing from you." "I suspected you were planning to steal from me," I corrected, "so I gave you the opportunity to prove me wrong or confirm my worst fears." "You chose to confirm them, David. You chose to empty what you thought was our life savings to buy luxury items for another woman." Vanessa was edging closer to the exit, but I wasn't finished with her yet. "And you, Vanessa, chose to target my husband as part of a systematic pattern of fraud that's destroyed multiple marriages across 3 states. Did you really think Portland would be different? Did you think you could run the same scheme here without anyone noticing?" Her mask of professional competence finally cracked completely. "I don't know what you're talking about." David approached me about this investment opportunity. "I'm just trying to help you find a good deal on real estate." "Really?" I asked, pulling out another folder. "Because I have documentation of your previous operations in California, Nevada, and Colorado. 7 married men, over $400,000 in theft, and a pattern of behavior that constitutes federal racketeering charges." The blood drained from Vanessa's face as she realized the scope of what I knew about her activities. She'd built her entire scheme around the assumption that her victims were isolated and wouldn't coordinate their responses or investigate her background thoroughly. "But the most interesting part," I continued, "is that this building we're standing in, I own it. I purchased it 6 months ago specifically for this operation, so when you attempted to sell me property that I already own, you committed fraud against the actual property owner. That's not just theft, Vanessa. That's commercial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny." The trap had sprung perfectly. David and Vanessa stood frozen in a building owned by their intended victim, surrounded by evidence of their crimes, having confessed to fraud attempts that were being recorded by law enforcement equipment. They'd walked voluntarily into a situation where escape was impossible and denial was futile. Outside, I could hear car doors closing as Detective Kim and her team took positions around the building. The investigation phase was over, and the arrest phase was about to begin. David and Vanessa had approximately 60 seconds of freedom remaining before they would be taken into custody for crimes that would send them both to federal prison. "Rachel," David said desperately, "we can work this out. I made mistakes, but we don't have to involve the police. I'll pay back everything I took. I'll end things with Vanessa. We can go to counseling." I looked at the man I'd been married to for 8 years, feeling nothing but sadness for what we'd lost and relief that the deception was finally over. "David, you didn't make mistakes. You made choices. You chose to steal from me, lie to me, and conspire to defraud me of additional money. Those aren't mistakes that can be fixed with counseling. Those are crimes that have consequences." The sound of footsteps on the building stairs announced the arrival of Detective Kim and her team. David and Vanessa both turned toward the sound with expressions of absolute terror, finally understanding that their situation was beyond their control. "Portland Police," Detective Kim announced as she entered the room with 2 uniformed officers. "David Thompson and Vanessa Price, you're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, theft in the first degree, and racketeering." As the handcuffs clicked into place, David looked at me with a mixture of rage and desperation. "You set me up. You planned all of this." "No, David," I replied calmly. "You set yourself up. I just gave you the opportunity to reveal who you really are, and you took it willingly." Vanessa said nothing as she was read her rights, but her eyes promised revenge if she ever got the chance. She'd built a career on manipulating and destroying other people's lives, and she was discovering that her final victim had decided to fight back with overwhelming force. As they were led away in handcuffs, I stood alone in the building I owned, surrounded by evidence of the most elaborate deception I'd ever orchestrated. The trap had worked perfectly, but victory felt hollow when the price was the complete destruction of my marriage and any remaining faith I'd had in the man I'd once loved. The silence in the commercial building after the police cars drove away was profound and strange, filled with the weight of 8 years of marriage ending in handcuffs and Miranda rights. I stood in what was now officially my property, surrounded by the scattered papers of a fraud scheme that would never be completed, feeling simultaneously vindicated and hollow. Justice had been served with surgical precision, but the cost had been everything I'd once believed about love, trust, and the man I'd shared my life with. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa, "Media requests already coming in. Portland Tribune wants an interview about the multi-state fraud ring. How do you want to handle publicity?" The reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just the end of my marriage, it was the beginning of a very public legal process that would expose every detail of David's betrayal and Vanessa's criminal enterprise. I drove home through familiar Portland streets that somehow looked different now, as if the entire city had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. Our house in Beaverton, the one David and I had chosen together with such optimism 5 years ago, now felt like a museum of a relationship that had died without me realizing it. Every room contained memories that would need to be reevaluated, every shared possession that would need to be divided or discarded. The legal proceedings began with stunning swiftness. Marcus had prepared for multiple contingencies, and by Monday morning, formal charges had been filed against both David and Vanessa in Multnomah County Superior Court. The evidence we'd gathered was so comprehensive that the district attorney's office immediately escalated the case to federal jurisdiction, invoking statutes that addressed crimes crossing state lines and systematic patterns of fraud. Detective Kim called Tuesday afternoon, with updates that were both satisfying and sobering. "The FBI has officially taken over the investigation," she reported. "They're treating this as a RICO case because of Vanessa's multi-state operation. Your husband and his girlfriend aren't just facing local theft charges anymore. They're looking at federal racketeering charges that carry minimum sentences of 10 years. 10 years, I repeated, processing the magnitude of what David had cost himself. And the other victims? 3 of them have already flown to Portland to testify. The case in California has been reopened based on your evidence, and Nevada is filing additional charges. Rachel, what you've done here isn't just going to put your husband and Vanessa Price in prison. It's going to provide justice for a lot of people who thought they'd never see it. That evening, I sat in our living room going through David's belongings with the methodical efficiency of someone conducting an archaeological dig. Every drawer revealed new evidence of his deception: credit card statements for accounts I'd never known existed, receipts for expensive gifts I'd never received, and printed emails discussing investment strategies that had nothing to do with our legitimate finances. The most devastating discovery was a folder hidden in his home office containing detailed notes about my daily routine, my work schedule, and my financial habits. David had been studying me like a research subject, documenting my patterns and vulnerabilities for months before executing his theft. The man I'd loved and trusted had been gathering intelligence for a campaign designed to rob me systematically while maintaining the facade of a loving marriage. Among his papers, I found draft versions of a letter he'd apparently planned to leave when he finally disappeared with Vanessa and my money. The letter apologized for falling out of love and suggested that I'd grown apart as people over the years. There was no mention of theft, fraud, or his systematic betrayal of our marriage vows. David had planned to rewrite history, painting himself as a man who'd simply found new love, rather than a criminal who'd stolen from his wife to fund an affair. The discovery that hurt most wasn't evidence of his crimes, but evidence of how little respect he'd had for my intelligence. David's plans were built on the assumption that I would accept his explanations without question, believe his lies without verification, and never investigate discrepancies in our finances. He'd convinced himself that I was too naive, too trusting, or too dependent on him to discover his deception. Wednesday brought the first media coverage, and seeing our story in the Portland Tribune made everything feel surreal and final. The headline read, "Local Woman Exposes Multi-State Fraud Ring After Husband's Betrayal," and the article portrayed me as either a hero or a victim, depending on how you interpreted the facts. The comments section was divided between people praising my strategic response and others questioning whether I'd gone too far in orchestrating David's downfall. One comment in particular stuck with me. If she suspected her husband was planning to steal from her, why didn't she just confront him directly instead of setting up an elaborate trap? It was a fair question that I'd been asking myself since watching David driven away in handcuffs. The answer was complicated and involved years of smaller betrayals, dismissed concerns, and growing evidence that direct confrontation wouldn't have changed anything fundamental about David's character. Marcus called Thursday morning with news about the legal proceedings. David's attorney is pushing for a plea bargain, he reported. They want to plead guilty to the theft charges in exchange for dropping the federal conspiracy charges. The prosecutor is considering it, but only if David provides complete cooperation in building the case against Vanessa. What does complete cooperation mean? Testifying against her, providing evidence of her methods, and admitting his role in the broader fraud scheme. Essentially, David would have to confess to everything and help send Vanessa to prison for 20 years instead of 10. I thought about David facing that choice: accept responsibility for his crimes and betray the woman he'd betrayed me for, or maintain loyalty to Vanessa and face decades in federal prison himself. Either way, he was learning that actions have consequences and that some betrayals can't be undone with apologies or excuses. What about restitution? I asked. That's where things get interesting, Marcus said with satisfaction. Because you documented everything so thoroughly, and because the trap account was a legitimate financial instrument, David is liable for far more than just the $50,000 he stole. The court can impose punitive damages for the fraud attempt, emotional distress damages for the systematic deception, and even RICO damages if they pursue the federal charges fully. The irony was staggering. David had stolen $50,000, thinking it represented my entire financial security, when it was actually the smallest portion of assets he knew nothing about. His betrayal was going to cost him hundreds of thousands in restitution, decades in prison, and any possibility of a normal life after release. Friday afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from David himself, calling collect from the Multnomah County Jail. I hesitated for several seconds before accepting the charges, unsure what I wanted to hear from the man who destroyed our marriage for money and sex. Rachel, his voice was hollow and defeated, barely recognizable as the confident man who'd tried to defraud me just days earlier. I need to talk to you. I'm listening, I said, though I wasn't sure why. I know you probably never want to see me again, and I understand that. But I need you to know that I never meant for things to go this far. When Vanessa first approached me, I thought it was just I don't know. Flattery. Attention. I never planned to steal from you. But you did steal from me, David. You planned it for months. I know, and I can't explain why I did it. It's like I became someone else, someone I don't recognize. The man who stole that money and tried to defraud you isn't who I am. I listened to his explanation with a mixture of sadness and anger. Even now, facing federal charges and the complete destruction of his life, David was trying to minimize his responsibility. He wanted to believe that his crimes were aberrations rather than revelations of his true character. David, I said finally, you are exactly who you chose to be. You chose to steal from me. You chose to lie to me. You chose to conspire with a criminal to defraud me of additional money. Those weren't mistakes or moments of weakness. Those were deliberate decisions you made repeatedly over months. Rachel, please. I know I can't undo what I did, but maybe we could work something out. If I cooperate with the prosecution, if I make restitution, maybe we could find a way forward. The suggestion was so disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. David apparently believed that our marriage could survive systematic theft, elaborate deception, and attempted fraud if he just apologized convincingly enough and paid back the money. There is no way forward for us, I said quietly. You didn't just steal money from me, David. You stole 8 years of my life based on lies. You made me doubt my own judgment and question my own worth. The man I married either never existed or died somewhere along the way, and I can't mourn him and forgive his killer at the same time. David was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd lost. I destroyed everything, didn't I? Yes, I said simply. You did. After hanging up, I sat in our kitchen thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about David's mindset. Even facing federal charges, he was still trying to negotiate, still believing that the right combination of words could undo the consequences of his actions. He wanted forgiveness without real repentance, reconciliation without accountability, and a future that ignored the reality of his choices. The weekend brought unexpected visitors. Tom Chen, David's business partner at Thompson Construction, stopped by Saturday morning to discuss the future of their company. Tom was a decent man who'd been completely blindsided by David's arrest and the revelation of his criminal activities. I had no idea, Tom said, sitting in our living room with legal documents spread across the coffee table. David always seemed like the most honest guy I knew. We've been partners for 6 years, and I never suspected he was capable of anything like this. How is this affecting the business? We're going to survive, but barely. Some clients are terminating contracts because they don't want to be associated with the scandal. Others are demanding new terms because they're worried about our financial stability. I'm going to have to buy out David's share of the company at a fraction of what it was worth last week. Tom's situation illustrated how David's crimes had ripple effects that extended far beyond our marriage. His business partner, employees, clients, and vendors were all suffering consequences for decisions they'd played no role in making. David's betrayal hadn't just destroyed our relationship, it had damaged everyone who'd trusted him professionally. Tom, I said carefully, I want you to know that I'll do whatever I can to help the business survive this. David's crimes are his responsibility, but the people who depend on Thompson Construction for their livelihoods shouldn't have to pay for his mistakes. That's generous of you, considering what he did. It's not generous, it's practical. David has already cost too many people too much. I'm not going to let his selfishness destroy more lives than necessary. Sunday evening, Vanessa's arrest made the national news. CNN ran a segment about romance fraud and financial crimes, using her case as an example of how sophisticated criminals target vulnerable victims through emotional manipulation. The segment included interviews with 3 of her previous victims, men who described the systematic way she'd infiltrated their lives and convinced them to betray their wives for money. Watching the broadcast, I realized that David wasn't unique in his vulnerability to Vanessa's manipulation. She'd refined her techniques over years of practice, learning exactly which psychological buttons to push and how to escalate men from innocent flirtation to major financial crimes. David had been a target, but he'd also been a willing participant who'd made conscious choices to steal and deceive. The following week brought depositions, court filings, and the beginning of what would become a years-long legal process. The federal prosecutor, Janet Morrison, was a serious woman in her 40s who specialized in white-collar crime and had built her reputation prosecuting complex fraud schemes. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, during our first formal meeting, "your evidence gathering in this case is the most comprehensive I've seen in 15 years of prosecuting fraud crimes. The recordings, financial documentation, and systematic approach you used have made this an airtight case. I just wanted to make sure that if David and Vanessa were going to commit crimes, there would be consequences. There will be significant consequences. Based on the evidence you've provided, I'm confident we can secure convictions that will result in substantial prison sentences for both defendants. More importantly, your case is going to serve as precedent for future prosecutions of similar schemes." Prosecutor Morrison explained that Vanessa's operation represented a new category of crime that combined traditional romance fraud with sophisticated financial manipulation. She'd created a business model that could be replicated by other criminals, which made her prosecution essential for preventing copycat operations. "What about the other victims?" I asked. "Will they see justice for what was done to them?" "All of Vanessa's previous crimes are being reopened and prosecuted based on your evidence. The men she manipulated are going to testify about her methods, and the wives who were defrauded are going to see their husbands held accountable for their crimes. Your case has opened the door for complete justice, not just partial accountability." That afternoon, I met with Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, a therapist who specialized in helping people recover from financial infidelity and marital betrayal. Marcus had recommended her, suggesting that I would need professional support to process the trauma of David's systematic deception. "What you've experienced isn't just adultery or theft," Dr. Rodriguez explained during our first session. "It's a form of psychological abuse called financial infidelity, combined with systematic gaslighting, designed to make you question your own perceptions and judgment. I keep wondering if I should have seen it coming sooner, if there were signs I missed." That's a normal reaction, but it's important to understand that David's deception was deliberate and sophisticated. He spent months studying your patterns and vulnerabilities specifically to avoid detection. The fact that you eventually discovered his crimes and responded strategically shows remarkable strength and intelligence, not failure or naivety. Dr. Rodriguez helped me understand that David's betrayal had been designed to destroy my self-confidence and make me dependent on his version of reality. By the time I'd discovered his theft, he'd been systematically undermining my trust in my own judgment for months, making me question financial discrepancies and dismiss suspicions that turned out to be completely accurate. "Recovery from this kind of betrayal isn't just about healing from infidelity," she continued. "It's about rebuilding your ability to trust your own perceptions and make decisions based on evidence rather than fear." Over the following weeks, I began the process of reconstructing my life without David and without the constant undercurrent of deception that had poisoned our marriage for months. The house felt different when I changed the locks and security codes, transforming it from a shared space filled with secrets into a private sanctuary where I could think clearly. I started using the commercial building I'd purchased for more than just evidence gathering. The second floor became the headquarters for a consulting business I'd been planning for years but had never pursued because David had convinced me it was too risky. Without his constant negativity and subtle sabotage disguised as concern, I discovered I was far more capable and confident than I'd realized. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's betrayal had freed me to pursue opportunities I'd been afraid to attempt while married to him. His theft had revealed not just his criminality, but also the ways he'd been limiting my potential through emotional manipulation and financial control disguised as partnership. 3 weeks after David's arrest, Vanessa's attorney contacted Marcus about a potential plea bargain. She was willing to plead guilty to all federal charges in exchange for cooperation in prosecuting other criminals in her network and a reduced sentence of 15 years instead of 25. "It's a good deal for justice," Marcus explained, "but it means Vanessa would be eligible for parole in 8 years with good behavior. She'd still be in her 40s when she gets out. And David's situation is more complicated. His cooperation with the prosecution could reduce his sentence significantly, but he'd still be looking at a minimum of 5 years in federal prison. His attorney is pushing for him to accept the plea bargain and testify against Vanessa." I thought about David facing that choice and realized I felt nothing but indifference about his decision. Whether he served 5 years or 15 years in prison wouldn't undo his betrayal or restore our marriage. The man I'd loved was gone, replaced by someone whose primary concern was minimizing consequences for crimes he'd committed willingly. Marcus, I said finally, I want whatever outcome provides the most justice for all of Vanessa's victims and sends the clearest message that this kind of crime has serious consequences. David made his choices. Now he gets to live with them. The legal machinery continued grinding forward with depositions, hearings, and plea negotiations, but I found myself caring less about the specific outcomes and more about the broader implications. David and Vanessa had committed crimes that destroyed lives and families, and they were going to face appropriate consequences. The details of their sentences mattered less than the certainty that their crimes wouldn't go unpunished. What mattered more was the slow process of rebuilding my life on a foundation of truth rather than deception, trust rather than suspicion, and self-reliance rather than dependence on someone who'd proven unworthy of faith. David's betrayal had cost me 8 years of marriage, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities I'd never fully recognized. The trap account that had caught David stealing had been more than just evidence gathering. It had been a test of my own judgment and planning abilities, proof that I could anticipate problems, prepare solutions, and execute complex strategies when necessary. David had underestimated me completely, and his failure had become my validation. 6 months after David's arrest, I stood in the renovated second floor of my commercial building, looking out at the Portland skyline through windows that now bore the logo of Thompson Strategic Consulting. The name had been deliberate, a reclaiming of the identity David had tried to steal along with my money. Where he'd seen weakness and naivety, I'd discovered strategic thinking and business acumen that had been suppressed by years of subtle manipulation disguised as marital partnership. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. There were nights when I'd wake up in our former bedroom, now stripped of everything that reminded me of our shared life, feeling the phantom pain of a marriage that had died slowly before ending abruptly. But those moments of grief were balanced by days of discovery, as I learned what I was capable of when not constantly second-guessing myself or seeking approval from someone who'd been undermining my confidence for his own purposes. My consulting business had grown with surprising speed, fueled by clients who were drawn to my story as much as my strategic abilities. Companies dealing with internal fraud, individuals recovering from financial betrayal, and organizations needing crisis management found value in working with someone who'd navigated betrayal with surgical precision rather than emotional chaos. The commercial building that had served as bait for David's final crime had become the foundation for a career I'd never imagined possible. Lisa visited regularly from Seattle, usually combining business trips with sisterly check-ins that had become increasingly unnecessary as my healing progressed. During her most recent visit, she'd brought updates about Vanessa's network that were both satisfying and sobering. The FBI investigation keeps expanding, she reported over coffee in my new office space. They've identified at least 12 additional victims across 7 states, and every case follows the same pattern Vanessa used with David. The prosecution is calling it the most systematic romance fraud operation they've ever uncovered. 12 more families destroyed, I said, thinking about the wives who'd experienced their own versions of my discovery day. But also 12 more families getting justice because of what you did. Rachel, without your evidence and strategic approach, Vanessa would have disappeared to another state and started over with new victims. She'd probably have continued for years before anyone figured out how to stop her. The federal trial had been scheduled for the following month, and both David and Vanessa had ultimately accepted plea bargains that avoided the risk of even longer sentences. David would serve 8 years in federal prison after agreeing to testify about Vanessa's methods and provide evidence about her other operations. Vanessa had received 12 years after pleading guilty to charges that included racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy across multiple jurisdictions. Their sentences felt appropriate rather than satisfying. No amount of prison time could restore the trust they'd destroyed or undo the trauma they'd inflicted on their victims. But their convictions would serve as precedent for future cases and warning to other potential criminals that sophisticated fraud schemes carried serious consequences. Marcus had handled the civil litigation with the same methodical precision he'd brought to the criminal case. David's share of Thompson Construction, our house, and every asset he'd accumulated during our marriage had been liquidated to pay restitution and damages. The final settlement had been larger than I'd expected, reflecting not just the money he'd stolen, but punitive damages for the systematic nature of his deception. The court awarded damages for emotional distress, loss of consortium, and breach of fiduciary duty. Marcus had explained during our final meeting about the financial settlement. David wasn't just your husband who stole money. He was your financial partner who violated every principle of trust and honesty that marriage represents. Tom Chen had successfully rebuilt Thompson Construction after buying out David's share at a court-mandated price that reflected the damage David's crimes had inflicted on the company's reputation. Tom had kept every employee and honored all existing contracts, proving that David's betrayal didn't have to destroy the livelihoods of innocent people who depended on the business. David built something good with that company. Tom had told me during one of our periodic check-ins about the business transition. It's ironic that his crimes almost destroyed the one legitimate success he'd achieved in his life. The irony extended beyond David's business to every aspect of his life before the betrayal. He'd thrown away a marriage to a woman who'd loved him, a partnership with a man who'd trusted him, and a reputation built over years of apparent honesty for what amounted to temporary pleasure and modest financial gain. Vanessa had manipulated him expertly, but he'd made conscious choices that revealed character flaws that had apparently existed long before she'd targeted him. Dr. Rodriguez had helped me understand that David's susceptibility to Vanessa's manipulation reflected deeper issues with integrity and impulse control that would have surfaced eventually, even if he'd never met her. The theft and fraud had been symptoms of character problems that made him fundamentally unsuitable for marriage or any relationship requiring trust and honesty. People don't become criminals overnight, she'd explained during one of our sessions. David's willingness to steal from you and lie to you so systematically suggests that he'd been capable of that kind of deception all along. Vanessa just provided the opportunity and motivation for him to reveal who he really was. My healing process had involved not just recovering from David's betrayal, but also recognizing the ways I'd ignored or rationalized warning signs that had been present throughout our relationship. His tendency to make financial decisions without consulting me, his casual dishonesty about small matters, and his pattern of making me feel guilty for questioning his judgment had all been precursors to the larger betrayal. You weren't naive or gullible, Dr. Rodriguez had assured me. You were trusting within the context of marriage, which is normal and healthy. David exploited that trust systematically, but that reflects his character flaws, not yours. The therapy had been crucial for distinguishing between appropriate trust within relationships and the kind of blind faith that ignored evidence of deception. I'd learned to trust my instincts while requiring verification, to extend goodwill while maintaining healthy skepticism, and to love without sacrificing my independence or judgment. 1 year after David's sentencing, I received a letter from him that had been screened by prison officials before being forwarded to my attorney. Marcus had asked whether I wanted to read it or have it destroyed without opening, and after careful consideration, I decided to read David's words one final time. The letter was 8 pages of handwritten self-reflection that revealed a man who'd finally begun to understand the magnitude of what he'd destroyed. David wrote about the therapy he'd received in prison, his growing awareness of the psychological damage he'd inflicted on me, and his acceptance that our marriage was irreparably over. I know you'll never forgive me, and I understand why, he'd written. What I did to you wasn't just theft or adultery, it was a systematic campaign to undermine your trust in your own judgment while I stole your money and betrayed every promise I'd made to you. I destroyed the best thing in my life for temporary pleasure and easy money. The letter continued with David's analysis of how Vanessa had manipulated him, but he was careful to acknowledge that her manipulation didn't excuse his choices. He'd recognized that he'd been a willing participant in crimes that had destroyed multiple lives, and he was using his prison time to understand why he'd been susceptible to that kind of influence. I want you to know that watching you expose our crimes and coordinate with law enforcement taught me more about your strength and intelligence than 8 years of marriage had, David had written. You were always more capable and strategic than I realized, and I think part of me was threatened by that. Vanessa made me feel important and admired, while you challenged me to be better than I was. The most honest part of the letter was David's admission that he'd been resentful of my success and independence, feeling diminished by my achievements rather than proud of them. Vanessa had exploited that resentment by making him feel like the dominant partner in their relationship, someone whose judgment was superior and whose desires were paramount. I convinced myself that I deserved better than a wife who questioned my decisions and had her own opinions about our finances. He'd written. Vanessa made me feel like the kind of man I thought I wanted to be, even though that man was actually a criminal and a liar. The letter concluded with David's acknowledgement that he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand and atone for his crimes, but that he didn't expect forgiveness or reconciliation. He wanted me to know that his betrayal had taught him painful lessons about integrity, consequences, and the value of what he destroyed. Reading David's letter had been emotionally exhausting but ultimately helpful for achieving complete closure. His words confirmed that the man I'd loved had been real but flawed, and that his crimes had revealed character defects that would have eventually destroyed our marriage even without Vanessa's intervention. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also freed me from a relationship built on a foundation that was fundamentally unstable. 2 years after the arrests, Vanessa's conviction had generated a documentary film about romance fraud that featured interviews with several of her victims and their families. The filmmakers had approached me about participating, but I'd declined, preferring to focus on building my new life, rather than relitigating the past for public consumption. The documentary had been well received, and had apparently inspired legislative changes in several states that made romance fraud easier to prosecute and punish. Vanessa's systematic approach to financial manipulation had revealed gaps in existing laws that prosecutors could now address more effectively. Lisa had watched the documentary and reported that it portrayed Vanessa as a sophisticated predator who'd perfected techniques for identifying and exploiting vulnerable men. The film had also highlighted the secondary trauma experienced by the wives and families who'd been victimized by her operations, drawing attention to aspects of romance fraud that were often overlooked by law enforcement and media coverage. "They used your case as the example of how victims can fight back effectively," Lisa had told me. "The filmmakers said your strategic response was unprecedented in their research of similar crimes." My business had continued growing, driven by referrals from satisfied clients and recognition within the consulting industry for innovative approaches to crisis management and strategic planning. The skills I'd developed during my investigation of David's crimes had proven valuable for helping other organizations navigate complex problems that required careful analysis and systematic solutions. I'd also begun speaking at conferences about financial fraud prevention and recovery, sharing insights about how individuals and families could protect themselves from the kind of systematic deception that had nearly destroyed my financial security. My presentations focused on practical strategies for detecting financial infidelity and building safeguards that could prevent or minimize damage from betrayal. The speaking engagements had led to consulting contracts with financial institutions that wanted to better serve clients dealing with fraud and financial abuse. Banks and credit unions were recognizing that financial infidelity was a widespread problem that required specialized responses beyond traditional fraud prevention measures. "Your experience gives you credibility that academic experts can't match," the director of one major credit union had explained when hiring my firm for a comprehensive training program. "You understand both the emotional and practical aspects of financial betrayal in ways that help our staff provide better support to affected members." 3 years after David's conviction, I'd completely renovated our former house and put it on the market. The sale had been emotionally complex, representing the final severance of ties to the life David and I had built together. But it had also been liberating, allowing me to invest in a new home that reflected my current life, rather than my past mistakes. The new house was smaller but more elegant, located in the Pearl District with views of the Willamette River and walking access to my office building. It was designed for entertaining clients and hosting the dinner parties that had become an important part of my business development strategy. The space reflected confidence and success without ostentation, professional competence without pretension. My personal life had evolved more slowly than my professional success. Dating felt complicated after experiencing such systematic betrayal, and I'd been cautious about developing romantic relationships that required trust and vulnerability. Dr. Rodriguez had helped me understand that healthy skepticism was different from defensive cynicism, and that learning to trust again would be a gradual process that couldn't be rushed. "You've learned to trust your own judgment, which is the foundation for trusting others appropriately," she'd observed during one of our final sessions. "The man who eventually earns your love will be someone who demonstrates integrity consistently over time, not someone who expects trust based on charm or promises." I'd dated several men over the 3 years since my divorce, but none had developed into serious relationships. The experience of David's betrayal had taught me to pay attention to subtle signs of dishonesty or manipulation that I might have previously overlooked. I was no longer willing to ignore small deceptions or rationalize behavior that made me uncomfortable. The 4th anniversary of David's arrest arrived on a crisp October morning that reminded me of the day I'd first discovered his theft. I marked the occasion by visiting the commercial building where we'd sprung our trap, now bustling with the activity of a successful consulting firm that employed 12 people and served clients across the Pacific Northwest. Standing in the same room where David and Vanessa had attempted their final fraud, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by their betrayal. What they'd intended as my destruction had become the foundation for achievements I'd never imagined possible. The trap account that had caught David stealing had been symbolic of a larger trap they'd set for themselves by underestimating their victim and overestimating their own cleverness. Marcus had remained a close friend and trusted advisor, helping me navigate the complex legal and financial aspects of building a business while managing the ongoing consequences of David's crimes. His support had been invaluable during the transition from victim to survivor to entrepreneur. "You've accomplished something remarkable," he'd told me during our most recent quarterly review of my business and financial situation. "Most people who experience this kind of betrayal spend years recovering emotionally and financially. You've built something stronger than what was destroyed." The success felt earned rather than lucky, built on skills and strength that had always existed but had been suppressed by years of subtle manipulation from someone who'd benefited from keeping me dependent and uncertain. David's betrayal had forced me to develop capabilities I'd never fully utilized, revealing potential that had been dormant during our marriage. My relationship with David's family had been complicated by his crimes and our divorce. His parents had initially been defensive about their son's actions, but they'd gradually come to understand the systematic nature of his betrayal and the justice of his punishment. They'd apologized for not recognizing the warning signs of his character problems and had expressed admiration for how I'd handled the crisis. "We raised David to be better than the man he became," his mother had written in a letter that arrived on the second anniversary of his conviction. "What he did to you was unforgivable, and we understand why you can't maintain a relationship with our family. But we want you to know that we're proud of how you responded to his betrayal and grateful that you stopped him before he could hurt more people." Tom Chen had prospered after rebuilding Thompson Construction, and he'd become an unexpected friend who provided perspective on David's character that I'd been too close to see clearly. Tom had worked with David for years and had observed behavioral patterns that were consistent with his ultimate betrayal. David was always looking for shortcuts and easy solutions, Tom had explained during one of our conversations about the business. He was talented and hardworking when things were going well, but he didn't handle pressure or setbacks well. When the business faced challenges, he'd start talking about get-rich-quick schemes and investment opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Tom's observations had helped me understand that David's susceptibility to Vanessa's manipulation reflected long-standing character traits that had made him fundamentally unsuitable for the responsibilities of marriage and business partnership. The affair and theft had been dramatic expressions of problems that had existed in subtler forms throughout our relationship. 5 years after the arrests, I received notification that David was eligible for early release due to good behavior and successful completion of rehabilitation programs. The news sparked a complex mixture of emotions: relief that his punishment was progressing toward completion, anxiety about his eventual return to society, and curiosity about whether his claimed transformation was genuine or merely strategic. The notification included information about victim notification procedures and restraining order options, but I declined both. David's release wouldn't affect my daily life or business activities, and I felt no need for legal protection from someone who'd already demonstrated his capacity for self-destruction when he attempted to harm me. Dr. Rodriguez had helped me understand that David's eventual release was part of the natural progression of consequences rather than a threat to my current security. "He's already lost everything that mattered to him," she'd observed. "His marriage, his business, his reputation, and his freedom. You've moved on to build a better life, while he's still dealing with the consequences of choices he made years ago." My current life bore little resemblance to the existence I'd shared with David. The woman who'd been married to him had been constrained by his limitations and diminished by his subtle manipulation. The woman I'd become was confident, successful, and surrounded by people who valued her judgment rather than questioning it. The consulting firm had expanded beyond my initial vision, developing expertise in crisis management, fraud prevention, and organizational integrity that served clients ranging from small businesses to major corporations. My reputation in the industry was built on the same analytical skills and strategic thinking that had exposed David's crimes and coordinated his prosecution. "You've created something that will outlast you," Lisa had observed during her most recent visit to Portland. "The business you've built helps people solve problems and prevent disasters." David's betrayal led to something constructive that benefits lots of people. The transformation felt complete rather than ongoing. The pain of David's betrayal had evolved into wisdom about human nature and resilience. The financial loss had been recovered many times over through business success that exceeded anything I'd achieved while married. The emotional trauma had been processed into strength that served me well in both personal and professional relationships. My dating life had gradually evolved into a relationship with Michael Garrett, a fellow entrepreneur who owned a successful architectural firm and understood the demands of building a business while maintaining personal integrity. Michael's approach to trust was similar to mine, cautious but not cynical, based on demonstrated behavior rather than promises or assumptions. "You're the most competent person I've ever met," Michael had told me early in our relationship, "but you're also the most careful about trusting people." I admire both qualities. Michael had known about my history with David before we'd started dating seriously, and he'd understood why I needed to proceed slowly with emotional intimacy. His patience and consistency had gradually earned my trust in ways that felt natural rather than forced. The relationship was different from my marriage to David in fundamental ways. Michael encouraged my independence rather than undermining it, celebrated my success rather than resenting it, and demonstrated integrity in small matters that built confidence in his character over time. The contrast had helped me understand how David's behavior had been subtly destructive even before his dramatic betrayal. Looking back on the 5 years since David's arrest, I could see how his betrayal had been a catalyst for positive changes that might never have occurred if our marriage had continued its slow decline toward mediocrity and mutual resentment. The crisis had forced me to develop capabilities and confidence that had transformed every aspect of my life for the better. The trap account that had caught David stealing had been symbolic of a larger principle. Sometimes the best way to deal with predators is to let them reveal their true nature while you prepare appropriate responses to their inevitable betrayal. David and Vanessa had destroyed themselves through their own greed and arrogance, while I'd used their crimes as the foundation for building something stronger and more authentic than what they'd attempted to steal. The commercial building where we'd sprung our trap had become the headquarters for a business that helped other people solve complex problems and recover from various forms of betrayal and crisis. The space where David and Vanessa had attempted their final fraud now hosted seminars, client meetings, and strategic planning sessions that created value rather than destroying it. David's letter from prison had been the last communication between us, and I had no interest in maintaining contact when he was eventually released. Our marriage was a chapter of my life that had ended completely, leaving lessons and strength but no lingering emotional connections. The man I'd loved had been real but flawed, and the man who'd betrayed me had revealed character defects that made him unsuitable for any relationship requiring trust and honesty. Standing in my office on the 5th anniversary of his arrest, I felt gratitude rather than bitterness about the experience we'd shared. David's betrayal had been devastating at the time, but it had also freed me to become someone I'd never imagined possible while married to him. The trap account had caught more than just a thief. It had revealed the possibility of a life built on authenticity rather than compromise, strength rather than dependence, and success rather than mere survival. The woman David had betrayed was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and capabilities. The life he'd tried to destroy had been rebuilt into something more substantial and satisfying than what we'd shared. The money he'd stolen had been recovered many times over through business success that reflected genuine achievement, rather than inherited wealth or fortunate circumstances. His betrayal had taught me that the most valuable trap you can set is the one that reveals truth rather than concealing it, that exposes character rather than hiding it, and that transforms victims into survivors who refuse to be diminished by other people's failures of integrity and judgment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.